day began like any other Monday at Blue Ridge Bank, a well-known financial institution in downtown Atlanta. The city was already alive with the noise of morning traffic, the steady hum of car engines, and the chatter of people hurrying down the sidewalks. Blue Ridge Bank, with its grand facade of gleaming glass and brick, was situated in the heart of this bustling activity. It was the kind of building that projected prestige, with high ceilings, tall windows, and a lobby designed to impress. Marble floors, brass fixtures, and a sense of quiet authority that immediately enveloped anyone who walked through the doors. Inside, the bank was already busy. Customers formed neat lines in front of tellers, the low hum of conversation mingling with the soft beeps of ATMs and the rustling of paper. It was a typical start to a busy Monday, and the bank's employees moved efficiently behind their desks, handling paperwork, answering phone calls, and greeting clients with professional smiles. At the center of it all, standing tall behind the main counter, was Emily Carson. Emily was Blue Ridge Bank's newest branch manager. It was a role she had worked hard to earn, climbing the ladder from a junior teller to this, her first real taste of authority. Her ambition had always been her driving force, and she had poured everything she had into reaching this point. Dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit with her dark hair pulled back in a tidy bun, Emily projected an air of cool professionalism. Her eyes, a clear shade of blue, scanned the lobby with a sense of purpose. She felt a thrill of excitement and nervousness. It was her first official Monday as the branch manager, and she was determined that it would be flawless. To Emily, first impressions were everything. She had prepared for this moment meticulously, arriving at the bank before sunrise to review reports, double-check the schedule, and ensure that every detail was in order. She had already greeted her team with a confident smile, holding a brief morning meeting to go over the day's priorities. Every transaction, every conversation, every interaction had to be perfect. This was the moment she would prove to her superiors that she was the right person for the job, capable of leading one of the busiest branches in the city. She had practiced her best in-charge smile in the mirror that morning, and she was ready. As she stood at the counter watching the flow of customers, she felt a sense of satisfaction. The staff moved like clockwork under her supervision. Everything was under control, just as she liked it. Emily was the kind of person who thrived on order, on predictability, on knowing exactly what to expect. And this Monday morning, as the minutes ticked by and the lines slowly moved, everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. Then the bell above the bank's heavy glass doors chimed. It was a soft sound, almost delicate, but enough to draw Emily's attention away from her computer screen. She glanced up just in time to see a man walk into the lobby. A middle-aged black man, dressed casually in a simple white shirt and a pair of faded jeans. His sneakers were worn, the kind of footwear that spoke of comfort rather than fashion or wealth. He didn't carry the usual trappings of the bank's more affluent clients. No designer briefcase, no tailored suit, no expensive watch flashing on his wrist. He simply looked like someone who might have walked in to cash a check or make a small withdrawal. The man's demeanor was calm and assured, his step light as he approached the counter where Emily stood. He looked like he had every right to be there, and he greeted her with a friendly, unhurried smile. For a moment, Emily's professionalism held. She returned his greeting with the kind of polite warmth that was expected in her position, her tone as even and controlled as ever. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and pleasant. "I'd like to make a deposit today." Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she prepared to log his request. "Of course, sir," she replied smoothly. "How much would you like to deposit?" The man's smile didn't waver. He leaned slightly closer to the counter and said, with a calm certainty that took her by surprise, $200 million. Emily's fingers stilled, her gaze locking onto his. For a fraction of a second, she thought she must have misheard him. Surely he hadn't just said $200 million. There was a beat of silence, a strange disconnect between his casual appearance and the staggering amount of money he had just mentioned. She looked him up and down, her practiced smile faltering for just a moment. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Did you say $200 million?" "That's right," he confirmed, still smiling easily. He reached into his pocket and produced an ID card and a bank card, sliding them across the polished counter toward her. "I'd like to make a deposit to my account." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly as she picked up the cards, glancing down at them before looking back at the man. It wasn't just the number that had thrown her. It was everything about him. His casual clothes, his unassuming demeanor, the fact that he hadn't walked in with an appointment or any sort of announcement. She had dealt with wealthy clients before, and they never arrived like this. There was always a sense of formality, a certain expectation of special treatment. Yet this man was behaving as if he were simply depositing a paycheck. Something didn't sit right with her. The number was too large, too unusual. Her first thought was that he must be a scammer, someone trying to pull a fast one on the bank. It was her job, she reminded herself, to protect the bank's assets. She had heard horror stories about people who tried to launder money or make fraudulent deposits, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. Not on her first real day in charge. "Just a moment, sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled. She needed time to verify the account information, to make sure that everything was legitimate. She ran his account details through the system, but the screen showed no flags, no warnings. Everything looked correct. But still, her instincts screamed that something was wrong. A man dressed like this didn't just walk in off the street to deposit $200 million. "I'll need to ask you a few questions to verify your information," she said, her tone cooling slightly. The man didn't seem fazed. He nodded, waiting patiently for her to continue. But Emily's doubt was already taking over, and the pleasant warmth she had shown earlier had disappeared. She began to ask about the source of his funds, about the purpose of the deposit, all while subtly checking the identification he had handed over. Everything was correct, but she wasn't satisfied. Her instincts told her that this was a situation she couldn't take at face value. As she questioned him, Emily felt a shift in the air. The lobby, which had been a background hum of activity, seemed to quiet around them. She noticed other customers turning their heads, sensing the oddness of the interaction. Whispers started to ripple through the lines as people picked up on the tension between Emily and the casually dressed man. He didn't raise his voice or push back against her questions. He simply answered each one, his patience unwavering. But Emily's voice grew firmer, each word clipped and suspicious. Finally, she told him she would need to take a moment to verify the account herself. She left the counter, holding the cards tightly in her hand, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she made her way to a nearby desk. The eyes of the bank followed her, curious and questioning, as the air seemed to hang heavy with a mixture of doubt and anticipation. Emily returned to her station, her posture rigid and her grip on the ID and bank card firm. The man was still waiting, his expression calm, almost serene, as if this interaction wasn't unusual for him. That calmness unsettled her further. Most people, especially those who knew they were under suspicion, would grow defensive or agitated. But he simply stood there, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his confidence unshaken. To Emily, his composure felt almost rehearsed, and her suspicions deepened. As she sat back down, she glanced quickly around the room. The lobby had grown quieter, the usual din of conversations and transactions softening as the tension between her and the man became more noticeable. Several customers were watching now, their gazes flicking between Emily and the man at her counter. Even the other tellers had slowed their pace, their movements distracted by the growing spectacle. Emily felt a prickle of irritation. She didn't want this scene to escalate, but she also couldn't let it slide. She had a responsibility to ensure the integrity of every transaction, and this one screamed for closer scrutiny. "All right, sir," she said, her tone professional but laced with skepticism. "I've looked at your account, and while the information matches what you provided, I still need more clarity about the source of the funds you're depositing. $200 million is not a small amount, and I'm sure you understand the need for thorough verification." The man nodded, his demeanor unchanged. "I understand," he said simply. "The funds come from my investments and business ventures. I own several tech companies and have significant holdings in various industries. The details should already be attached to my account profile." Emily typed a few commands into her computer, her eyes scanning the screen intently. The account was real, and the information he had provided about his holdings and investments matched perfectly. Still, her unease persisted. She couldn't reconcile the image of the man in front of her with the staggering wealth his account displayed. Something didn't add up. People with that kind of money didn't just stroll into a bank unannounced, casually dressed and unaccompanied. They made appointments. They brought assistants or lawyers or accountants. They didn't handle transactions like this on their own. "Sir," she said, her voice hardening slightly, "I'm going to need more than just your word. If you're truly depositing funds of this magnitude, you must have supporting documentation. Bank policy requires transparency for deposits over a certain threshold." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, but his expression remained composed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to her without a word. Emily unfolded it carefully. It was a detailed statement of his holdings, signed and notarized. Everything appeared legitimate, and it matched the details she had already seen on his account profile. But Emily's doubts weren't entirely erased. She couldn't let go of the feeling that something was off. She wanted, no, needed more confirmation. "Just a moment, sir," she said again, rising from her chair. She took the paper and the ID with her as she walked toward the back office, where she could call the main verification department. Her heels clicked loudly on the marble floor, each step punctuating the growing tension in the room. She could feel the weight of the customer's stares on her back, and it only added to her frustration. At the back office, she dialed the number for the bank's headquarters, her fingers pressing the buttons with sharp precision. When the line connected, she quickly explained the situation, her tone clipped and efficient. The person on the other end of the line assured her that everything about the account and the client checked out. The funds were legitimate, the man was who he claimed to be, and there were no red flags. Still, Emily wasn't satisfied. "Are you absolutely sure?" she pressed, her voice dropping lower. "This is a significant transaction. I need to be certain there's no mistake." And the voice on the other end of the line sounded slightly exasperated. "Yes, Miss Carson. Mr. Reed is one of our high net worth clients. His account is in perfect standing, and his credentials have been verified multiple times in the past. If he's making a deposit, it's legitimate." Emily thanked them curtly and hung up, but the call did little to ease her unease. She had the confirmation she needed, but her instincts still screamed that something wasn't right. She hesitated for a moment, gripping the phone tightly as she considered her next move. Returning to the counter felt like a defeat, an acknowledgement that she had been wrong to doubt him, but she also knew she couldn't keep stalling. The longer she delayed, the more the situation would spiral out of her control. When she returned to the counter, the atmosphere in the lobby had shifted further. The customers were no longer simply watching, they were murmuring among themselves, their whispers carrying an edge of curiosity and unease. Even the tellers had paused their work, their gazes flicking toward Emily as she took her seat. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. "Sir," she began, her voice strained but controlled, "I've confirmed your account and your credentials. Everything appears to be in order." She hesitated, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before darting away. "However, I still find this situation unusual. You must understand, transactions of this size typically follow a very different process." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression softening with a hint of amusement. "Miss Carson," he said, his tone calm but firm, "I appreciate your diligence, but I assure you, there's nothing unusual about my request. I've been a client of this bank for years, and I've made deposits like this before without issue. Is there something specific about me that's making you question this transaction?" Emily stiffened at the subtle challenge in his words. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, she heard the sound of the glass doors opening behind her. She turned slightly, and her heart sank. Standing in the doorway, his sharp suit immaculate and his expression unreadable, was Mr. Harris, the regional manager. He had walked into the middle of a situation that had already spiraled far beyond Emily's control. Mr. Harris stepped into the lobby with an air of authority that immediately drew attention. His tall frame and sharp suit made him impossible to miss, and the sound of his polished shoes against the marble floor seemed to echo louder than usual in the now muted atmosphere. He was the regional manager of Blue Ridge Bank, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor and unwavering professionalism. It was clear that he hadn't been expecting anything unusual during his routine visit to the branch, but as he took in the scene before him, his steps slowed slightly and his sharp eyes zeroed in on Emily at the main counter. Emily felt her stomach tighten as she saw him approach. The last thing she wanted was for Mr. Harris to witness her struggling to manage a situation. She had worked so hard to earn this position, to prove herself capable and composed. Yet here he was, walking in at the worst possible moment. For a fleeting second, she considered brushing the whole thing aside, pretending that everything was under control. But the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. It was too late to salvage her carefully crafted image of control. The customers were watching, the tellers were distracted, and the man at her counter, still calm and collected, stood as a quiet centerpiece in the chaos she had inadvertently created. "Miss Carson," Mr. Harris said as he reached her station, his tone even but carrying the weight of authority. "What's going on here?" Emily straightened her posture, forcing a professional smile onto her face, despite the anxiety creeping through her. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice steady, though it took effort to keep it that way. "This gentleman is attempting to make a deposit, but the transaction is unusual." Mr. Harris's gaze shifted to the man standing at the counter. There was a brief moment of silence as his sharp eyes took in every detail. The man's casual clothing, his calm demeanor, and the stack of documents and ID cards spread across the counter. For a fraction of a second, Harris's expression flickered, a subtle change that Emily couldn't quite read. Then his face softened, his lips curving into a polite but surprised smile. "Mr. Reed," he said, his tone shifting completely, now warm and respectful. He extended a hand toward the man. "It's a pleasure to see you again. I didn't realize you'd be visiting this branch today." Emily's heart sank. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Mr. Reed. Her mind scrambled to process the implications. She had heard the name before in meetings and memos, but never in a context that suggested she might encounter him personally. Jonathan Reed was a legend in the financial world, a tech entrepreneur and investor whose wealth and influence were unparalleled. He wasn't just a wealthy client, he was one of Blue Ridge Bank's most significant investors, a cornerstone of the institution's success. Mr. Reed accepted Mr. Harris's handshake with a gracious smile, his manner as calm and collected as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," so he said. "I didn't think I'd need to announce my visit. I'm just here to take care of a routine transaction." "Of course," Harris replied smoothly, his tone carrying an unmistakable deference. "Anything we can do to make your experience more comfortable, you let us know." Emily's pulse quickened. Her mind raced through the events of the past few minutes, replaying every word she had said, every moment of doubt and suspicion she had shown. She felt her face flush with heat as the weight of her mistake began to settle on her. This wasn't just any client she had doubted. This was Jonathan Reed, a man whose influence could make or break her career, and she had treated him as though he were a scammer. Mr. Harris turned back to Emily, his polite smile fading into a more neutral expression. "Miss Carson," he said, his tone now cooler, "is there a reason this transaction hasn't been processed yet?" Emily's throat went dry. She struggled to find the right words, her professionalism crumbling under the pressure of the moment. She began, then hesitated. "I wasn't aware of Mr. Reed's history with the bank. I thought it necessary to take extra precautions given the nature of the deposit." Harris's eyebrows rose slightly, his expression remaining neutral, but with an edge that made her stomach drop further. "Mr. Reed's history with the bank is well documented," he said firmly. "His account has been in excellent standing for years. Any concerns you might have could have been addressed with a simple call to our verification department." Emily felt the sting of his words, but she knew he was right. She had called verification, but not until she had already created an unnecessary spectacle. The murmurs from the customers had grown louder now, the tension in the room palpable. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble floor beneath her and escape the growing sense of humiliation. Mr. Reed, for his part, remained remarkably composed. He turned to Emily, his expression kind but firm. "I understand you were doing your job," he said, "but it's important to approach every client with respect, regardless of how they look or how unusual the situation might seem." His words, though delivered without malice, cut deeply. Emily nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Reed," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harris sighed, his tone softening slightly but still carrying a note of disappointment. Miss Carson, I understand you're new to this position, but we expect our managers to exercise sound judgment and professionalism at all times. This is not the level of service we strive to provide to any client, let alone someone of Mr. Reed's stature. Emily nodded again, her humiliation complete. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on her, the silent judgment of the customers and her colleagues. She had wanted so badly to prove herself capable and competent, but now she had made a mistake so glaring that it might cost her everything she had worked for. Mr. Harris turned back to Mr. Reed, his tone shifting again to one of deference. Let's take care of this in my office, Mr. Reed. I'll personally ensure everything is processed smoothly. Thank you, Mr. Harris, Reed said with a nod. I appreciate that. As the two men walked away, heading toward the private offices at the back of the branch, Emily stood frozen at the counter. The whispers among the customers grew louder, and she could feel the judgment in their stares. Her career had just taken a dramatic turn, and she wasn't sure if she would recover from it. As Mr. Harris and Mr. Reed disappeared into the private office at the back of the bank, the tension in the lobby didn't dissipate. It lingered like a heavy fog, a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment from everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Emily remained standing behind her counter, her posture stiff, her mind reeling. She felt the weight of every gaze on her, the whispers of the customers carrying an undeniable tone of disapproval. It was as if the air itself had grown thicker, making it hard for her to breathe. She glanced around, hoping to find something, anything, that could distract her from the shame burning in her chest. But the looks on the faces of her colleagues didn't help. Some stared at her with thinly veiled pity, while others exchanged sidelong glances, their expressions unreadable but clearly tinged with judgment. She couldn't tell if they were disappointed in her, amused by her mistake, or simply relieved that they weren't in her position. The realization only deepened the ache in her chest. She had not only humiliated herself, but had also tarnished the professional image she had worked so hard to cultivate. The whispers grew louder, scattered comments from the customers carrying across the marble floor. "Can you believe that?" one man muttered to his companion, shaking his head. "She didn't even know who he was." "Unbelievable," a woman whispered. "Imagine treating someone like that, especially someone like him." Emily's face flushed with heat, her cheeks burning as if the whispers were daggers piercing her skin. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had only been doing her job, that she had acted out of caution rather than malice. But deep down, she knew that no explanation would excuse what had just happened. Her actions had been rooted in assumptions, assumptions that had blinded her to the truth and led her to treat one of the bank's most important clients with suspicion and disrespect. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the stack of papers on her counter, pretending to organize them in an attempt to distract herself. The effort was futile. Her mind refused to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread that hung over her. She had wanted so desperately to prove herself in this new role, to show her superiors that she was capable of handling the responsibility of managing a branch. But now it felt as though she had undone all of that in a matter of minutes. She didn't know how much time had passed when Mr. Harris finally emerged from the private office, his expression as unreadable as ever. He walked back into the lobby with long, purposeful strides, his shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor. Behind him, Mr. Reed followed at a more measured pace, his calm demeanor unchanged. The two men paused near the center of the lobby, and for a brief moment, Emily dared to hope that the worst was over. That hope was dashed when Mr. Harris turned his sharp gaze toward her. His expression wasn't angry, but it was heavy with disappointment, a look that somehow cut deeper than outright anger ever could. "Miss Carson," he said, his voice firm but even, carrying across the quiet lobby. "I need to speak with you." Emily's stomach churned as she nodded and stepped out from behind the counter. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward him, each step bringing her closer to a reckoning she couldn't avoid. When she reached him, she kept her head bowed slightly, unable to meet his eyes. "Mr. Reed has completed his transaction," Mr. Harris said, his tone professional but laced with a cold edge. "He's been kind enough to handle this matter with grace, but we need to address what happened here today." Emily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper as she replied, I understand, sir. No, I don't think you fully understand, Harris said, his voice sharpening slightly. This isn't just about one mistake. This is about the culture we foster here at Blue Ridge Bank. We pride ourselves on treating every client with respect and professionalism, regardless of their appearance, their background, or any assumptions we might make about them. Today, you failed to uphold that standard. His words stung, each one landing like a blow to her already fragile sense of confidence. She wanted to explain herself, to tell him that her actions had been driven by caution, not prejudice, but she knew it wouldn't matter. The truth was that she had let her assumptions cloud her judgment, and now she was facing the consequences. Miss Carson, Mr. Harris continued, his tone softening just slightly, I understand that you're new to this role, and I know that mistakes happen. But this was more than just a mistake. You embarrassed a valued client, created an unnecessary scene, and disrupted the operations of this branch. That is not the kind of leadership we need. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry as she struggled to find her voice. I, I'm truly sorry, she said finally, her words trembling with emotion. I didn't mean to disrespect Mr. Reed. I was just trying to protect the bank. I believe you, Harris replied, his tone still measured. But intention doesn't erase impact. You've made it clear today that you still have a lot to learn about what it means to lead. There was a long, heavy silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Emily felt her eyes burn with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to break down in front of him. Effective immediately, Harris said after a pause, you are relieved of your position as branch manager. You may remain with the bank in a different capacity, but your conduct today has made it clear that you are not ready for this level of responsibility. The finality of his words hit her like a punch to the chest. She nodded numbly, unable to muster the strength to argue or plead her case. She knew he was right. She had let her assumptions and her need to assert control overshadow her duty to treat every client with dignity. And now she was paying the price. As Mr. Harris turned back to Mr. Reed, Emily stepped back, retreating toward her counter as quietly as possible. The whispers in the lobby had grown louder again, but she forced herself not to listen. Instead, she focused on gathering her things, each movement deliberate and mechanical as she tried to hold herself together. When she finally left the branch, stepping out into the bright sunlight of downtown Atlanta, she felt as though the world had grown quieter somehow, her own humiliation drowning out everything else. Inside the bank, Mr. Reed shook Mr. Harris's hand one last time before leaving. As he walked past the remaining customers, several of them clapped softly, a quiet acknowledgement of his grace and composure in the face of what had happened. The sound of their applause echoed faintly through the lobby, a reminder of the lesson that Emily's mistake had taught everyone that day. Respect wasn't about appearances or assumptions. It was about seeing people for who they truly were. And in this case, the truth had been painfully clear. The private office at the back of the bank was a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the lobby. It was a quiet, pristine space designed for discretion, with walls painted a calming shade of gray and furniture that spoke of understated luxury. The desk at the center was immaculate, its surface polished to a mirror-like shine, with neatly arranged pens, a phone, and a single monitor. The air in the room was cool, faintly scented with the smell of leather from the chairs. Mr. Harris gestured for Mr. Reed to take a seat as he stepped around to the other side of the desk, his demeanor still composed, but carrying an added layer of respect. Mr. Reed, Mr. Harris began, his tone as measured as always, I want to personally apologize for what happened out there. That level of treatment is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the failure on our part to meet your expectations. Jonathan Reed, still calm and collected, eased into the chair and rested his hands lightly on the armrests. He regarded Mr. Harris with a look of quiet understanding. There's no need to apologize further, he said. You've addressed the issue appropriately, and I trust that the situation won't be repeated. Mistakes happen, even in the best organizations. His voice was steady, unflinching, but there was a weight behind his words that made it clear he didn't take the incident lightly. Mr. Harris nodded, acknowledging both the grace with which Mr. Reed had handled the situation and the subtle reminder of the bank's responsibility to uphold its standards. Thank you for your patience, Harris said. Let's proceed with the transaction. I'll oversee everything personally to ensure there are no further disruptions. Jonathan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thin leather-bound folder. Inside was a detailed set of documents, statements, authorizations, and certificates related to his businesses and the funds he was depositing. He handed them across the desk, his movements deliberate and precise, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. Harris took the folder and began reviewing the papers carefully, his trained eye scanning each line for the necessary details. The process was methodical, almost silent, save for the occasional rustle of paper or the clicking of keys as Harris entered the relevant information into his system. Mr. Reed sat patiently, his posture relaxed but attentive. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone commanded respect, and Harris worked with a quiet efficiency that reflected his desire to resolve the matter as swiftly as possible. Meanwhile, in the lobby, the aftermath of the earlier incident still lingered. The customers who had witnessed the confrontation continued to whisper among themselves, their conversations a mix of speculation and judgment. The bank's employees, now trying to return to their routines, moved with a slightly subdued energy, their usual confidence dampened by the weight of what had transpired. The entire branch felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for some unseen signal to release the tension that hung in the air. Back in the office, the transaction was nearing its conclusion. Harris had verified all the necessary details, cross-referenced the documents with the bank's records, and ensured that every requirement was met. He leaned back slightly, removing his glasses and setting them on the desk as he looked across at Mr. Reed. "Everything is in order," he said, his tone carrying a note of finality. "Your deposit has been processed successfully. If there's anything else we can assist you with today, please don't hesitate to let me know." Mr. Reed gave a small nod, his expression one of polite satisfaction. "That will be all for now," he said. "Thank you for your attention to this matter." Harris stood as Mr. Reed rose from his chair, extending his hand once more. The two men shook hands firmly, a gesture that conveyed both mutual respect and a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons the day had imparted. As Mr. Reed turned to leave, Harris followed him out of the office, ensuring that his departure was as smooth and dignified as possible. The lobby quieted further as Mr. Reed emerged, his calm, self-assured presence once again commanding attention. Customers turned to watch him, some offering small smiles or nods of respect. A few even began to clap, a soft and scattered applause that grew as he made his way toward the exit. It wasn't the kind of dramatic ovation reserved for heroes or celebrities, but rather a quiet, collective recognition of the grace with which he had handled an unfair situation. Jonathan paused briefly near the door, turning back to glance at the room one last time. His gaze wasn't accusatory or harsh. It was simply steady, a look that seemed to carry an unspoken reminder that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter the circumstances. Without a word, he opened the door and stepped out into the bright sunlight of the Atlanta morning, disappearing into the busy streets beyond. Inside the bank, the applause faded into silence. The customers began to return to their business, but the mood had shifted. The incident had left an impression, a quiet ripple of awareness that spread through everyone who had been present. It was a reminder of the power of assumptions, the danger of judging someone based on surface appearances, and the importance of treating every individual with respect. Mr. Harris remained in the lobby for a moment, his expression thoughtful. He turned to the staff, his gaze lingering on each of them as if to ensure that the lesson had been absorbed. Then, without a word, he returned to his office, leaving the employees to reflect on the events of the morning. For Emily, who had watched Mr. Reed leave from a distance, the moment carried a deep sense of finality. She stood behind the counter, her hands clenched tightly at her sides as she fought to keep her emotions in check. The weight of her mistake pressed heavily on her chest, and she knew that the path ahead would not be an easy one. She would have to rebuild her reputation, repair the trust she had broken, and learn to approach her role with a humility and awareness she had lacked before. As the day wore on, the bank returned to its usual rhythm. Customers came and went, transactions were processed, and the hum of activity resumed. But the memory of what had happened that morning lingered, a quiet reminder of the lessons that had been learned and the change they would inspire. The day at Blue Ridge Bank eventually settled back into its usual rhythm, but the events of that morning left a mark that couldn't be ignored. Conversations continued in hushed tones, the tension in the air slowly giving way to a reflective quiet. Customers who had witnessed the incident carried the memory with them as they left, their expressions contemplative. For those who remained, the atmosphere was heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired, a stark reminder of the importance of respect and the consequences of failing to offer it. Jonathan Reed's exit had been quiet but commanding. The image of his calm, composed demeanor lingered in the minds of everyone who had seen him walk out the door. He hadn't raised his voice or acted with indignation, yet his presence alone had delivered a powerful message. It was a lesson not just for Emily Carson, but for every person in the bank that day. For Emily, the weight of her actions grew heavier as the day wore on. She remained at her post, but the confidence she had once carried was gone, replaced by a deep sense of remorse. Each transaction she processed felt like a small reminder of her failure, the customer's polite but distant demeanor serving as an unspoken judgment. Her colleagues, who had once looked to her as their new leader, now seemed unsure of how to approach her. Some offered sympathetic smiles while others avoided her entirely, their silence speaking volumes. Her mind replayed the events over and over, each detail etched into her memory. She thought of Jonathan Reed's steady gaze, the way he had answered her questions without anger or frustration, despite her obvious mistrust. She thought of the moment Mr. Harris had arrived, his demeanor shifting immediately when he recognized Reed. And most painfully, she thought of the applause that had followed Reed's departure, a quiet but powerful reminder of the respect he had earned despite her failure to offer it. When her shift finally ended, Emily gathered her things with trembling hands. The usual chatter and goodbyes among the staff were absent. The room felt colder, more subdued. She walked out of the bank without saying much, the sound of her shoes against the marble floor echoing in the silence. As she stepped outside, the noise of the city enveloped her, car horns, conversations, and the steady hum of life moving forward. But for her, the world felt strangely still, as if she were standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite define. She walked slowly, her thoughts a jumble of regret and self-recrimination. The streets of downtown Atlanta were bustling, the sidewalks crowded with people hurrying to their destinations. Emily moved among them like a ghost, her mind too preoccupied to notice the sights and sounds around her. She thought of her career, the ambition that had driven her to take the role of branch manager, and the pride she had felt on her first day. It all seemed so distant now, overshadowed by the mistakes she had made. That evening, she sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the city lights outside her window. The silence was oppressive, her thoughts louder than the bustling streets below. She replayed every word she had spoken to Jonathan Reed, cringing at the tone she had used, the assumptions she had made. Her training had emphasized the importance of client respect, but in that moment, she had let her biases take over, blinded by her need to assert control and prove herself in her new role. Now that moment would define her career, at least for the foreseeable future. She thought of Mr. Harris's words, his disappointment etched into every syllable. Intention doesn't erase impact. The phrase repeated in her mind like a mantra, a painful reminder of the truth she couldn't deny. She hadn't intended to be disrespectful, but her actions had caused harm nonetheless. It wasn't just about her career. It was about the message her behavior had sent, the assumptions she had perpetuated. She had failed not only herself, but also the values the bank was supposed to represent. The next morning, Emily arrived at the bank early, her steps hesitant as she entered the building. She knew her role had changed, that she would no longer hold the title of branch manager. But she also knew she had a responsibility to face her colleagues and begin the process of rebuilding trust. The whispers began as soon as she walked in, her presence drawing the same curious glances and quiet murmurs as the day before. She ignored them as best she could, focusing instead on the tasks she had been assigned. As the day progressed, she noticed subtle changes in the way her colleagues interacted with her. There was still an undercurrent of tension, but some of them began to offer small gestures of support. A kind word here, a nod of encouragement there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that redemption was possible, even if it would take time. Meanwhile, the incident continued to ripple outward. Customers who had been present shared the story with friends and family, the details spreading through conversations and social media. The bank's leadership took notice, issuing a statement reaffirming their commitment to treating all clients with respect and dignity. It wasn't just about damage control. It was about setting an example, ensuring that the lesson learned that day would resonate throughout the organization. Jonathan Reed, for his part, continued his life as usual. He had no interest in seeking retribution or dwelling on the incident. To him, the experience was a reminder of the challenges that still existed, the biases and assumptions that persisted even in professional settings. But he also saw it as an opportunity, a chance to highlight the importance of respect, to encourage dialogue and reflection. He hoped the lesson would extend beyond the walls of the bank, sparking conversations that might lead to meaningful change. For Emily, the journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would never forget the events of that day. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a turning point, a moment that forced her to confront her own biases and shortcomings. She resolved to learn from it, to grow into a better version of herself, both as a professional and as a person. The path wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to walk it, step by step, with humility and resolve. And so, life at Blue Ridge Bank moved forward. The lobby returned to its usual hum of activity, the staff adjusted to their new roles, and the lessons of that day settled into the fabric of the institution. For some, it was a story to tell. For others, it was a moment of reflection. But for Emily Carson, it was a chapter she would carry with her always. A reminder of the power of respect, the danger of assumptions, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are.